All right, 8 p.m., 10/10/2024. Um, Last video I showed my recent Paddy Chayefsky collected works and talked a little bit about them, and now I would like to begin reading them. For whatever reason, Altered States jumped out at me. I had heard of Marty. I'd heard of Middle of the Night. I'd heard of Network in the Chayefsky canon, but I hadn't heard of some others, and Altered States being one of them. Altered States is a screenplay. Let's see. It's based on the 1978 novel by Paddy Chayefsky, and he then adapted it into a screenplay in 1980. And I'm going into this as cold as possible. I'm reading a little bit off of Wikipedia, and I need to stop because I know nothing about this. And what I have in front of me is the script. So I'm reading a screenplay essentially. So that's a little bit different. And I've never really, I don't want to say I've never read a script aloud. That's not true. But I don't think I've read a Paddy Chayefsky script aloud. Let's see. And it's about 100 and 110 pages. So that's a full-fledged film essentially. It's not quite 120, but you got a movie with 110 pages. So I may check YouTube or Tubi to see if I can't find a copy of this film, but never seen it, never heard of it until now. So let's jump in and see what we got going here. And again, this is very casual. This is not a professional read. I would advise you to see the movie. This is just for fun. So let's have some fun. Altered States, 1980, written for the screen by Paddy Chayefsky as Sidney Aaron. From the novel Altered States by Paddy Chayefsky. Executive producer Daniel Melnick, produced by Howard Gottfried, directed by Ken Russell. And let me see Ken Russell. What do I know, Ken? It sounds familiar. Do I know any of Ken's work? Sounds really Tommy. The Rainbow, I've heard. Horror, I've heard of. Okay. And that's about it. I want to say Crimes of Passion. Do I know that one? Listomania. Looks like I need to check out Ken Russell's filmography. The Devils, I've heard of that one. Yeah, I've heard of that one, definitely. Song of Summer. Women Love, the whole filmography I've yet to check out. Great. All right, directed by Ken Russell. And cast of characters is a lengthy one, but in the film adaptation, William Hurt, the great Bob Balaban, whom I love, Drew Barrymore. She must have played a kid in this. And I'm looking, see if John Larroquette, Paul Larson, Adrian Shaw. Okay. All right. So let's see. Now I kind of want to watch the movie, but let's go. All right. Fade in. Wide angle shot of a sound attenuated room with blue steel walls. Because the lighting is subdued, most of the room is in shadows. Dominating it in the very center is a large covered tank with a sacrificial, sinister appearance. The camera stares at it. Narrator. The tank itself was unusual in that it was vertical and looked like an old boiler. Inside the tank, the subject wore a glass bubble. and you would have thought the whole contraption uncomfortable, to say the least. It was, however, effective. From another angle, our eyes grow accustomed to the dim lighting. We notice a few valves sticking out of the tank, cables and hoses trailing across the floor. Narrator. Of the 23 students tested, only 2 found it unpleasant. Some even called it exhilarating. A number of students hallucinated. Inside the tank itself, the whitish form of a naked man can be distinguished, floating in the darkness just below the surface of the inky water, like a huge dead fish with its belly up. Close up on the man shows a white mask of a face, eyes closed, an austere Calvinist face, although a young man, 28 years old. We may notice 8 EEG leads issuing out of his scalp. Narrator. The others reported experiences ranging from pleasant to exhilarating. The screen suddenly goes utterly black. Images flicker across the black screen. A sudden narrow band of color, mud brown, much too brief to identify beyond its happening. Narrator. Dr. Jessup found the encephalographic evidence especially interesting, and one Saturday afternoon in 1967 he decided to try the experience for himself. Credits and title move horizontally across the screen. Altered states. For purposes of identification, close-up of Jessup's monastic face again. Narrator. Within minutes after the activating experience, well-organized alpha waves of 40 to 50 microvolts, 11 to 12 seconds, appeared in all regions. Again, a fleeting band of imagery. A broader band lasts just long enough for us to see that the grains in the wooden interior walls behind the black aluminum interior lining of the tank are sinuating, as if alive. Narrator. After 15 minutes, there was an increase in the alpha amplitude, as much as 30 to 70 microvolts, predominantly in the frontal and central regions. The screen suddenly takes on a gray sheen and just as abruptly goes black. Narrator. At the half-hour mark, rhythmical waves of 7 to 8 seconds appeared, and then, suddenly, another fleeting image. Too quick to be really distinguishable, a vivid baked orange flash with something red and white on screen just long enough to recognize some kind of animal in the white. Narrator. Rhythmical theta trains, 6 to 7 seconds, 70 to 100 microvolts. This EEG pattern was startling, similar to those of Zen priests in Zazen. The images come with increasing frequency. Image. A stunted, dwarfed fig tree, shedding its fruit. Image. A rocky terrain, the barren Judean hills. Image. The animal we briefly saw, now recognizable as a white lamb with 7 eyes and 7 horns. Its throat is slashed. It is dripping blood. Image. The entire screen is suddenly white, radiant, near to blinding. Image. A sudden blare of the organ, cathedral music, snatch of Bach. A second later, silence. Image. A twisted biblical street, empty, crooked, narrow, cobbled, twisting between the pitted white walls of small stone buildings. Image. The screen is utterly black again. Image. Jessup's breathing. Image. A fluttering image of a green Veronica, one of those religious handkerchiefs painted with the face of Christ. A chalk-white face of an anguished Christ, little red Cupid doll spots on his cheeks, a crown of thorns on his brow. Image. A surreal landscape, an endless stretch of brilliantly white beach. Image. A sacrificial white lamb again, this time lying on a rude stone altar. A curved knife held in a white hand comes slashing down and cuts the lamb's throat. A burst of blood. Image. A man dying on a white hospital bed in a lemon-colored hospital room. Image. A closer view of the man's face. A wax mask. A bubble of air forms on his lips which barely move. He is trying to say something. It's inaudible. Image. The green Veronica with a white Christ face on it. Image. Beads of red blood dripping against a white screen. Image. A hailstorm of hail and blood. Image. The screen is black again, the blackness of space. A humming, droning sound, resonating, getting louder, the drone of primal energy. A pinned spot of twinkling light, a distant star would seem moving toward us. Then we recognize it isn't a star, but a blackbird. It seems to have a human face, the face of a suffering saint, an agonized martyr's face complete with halo. The bird is Ba, the eternal soul of pharaonic Egypt. The face is Saint Sebastian's. It veers in its flight and comes swooping horribly at us, filling the screen with its enormous black wings. Image. The rude stone altar with the sacrificial white lamb. Blood drips from its slashed throat. Pan down the altar to the ground where a large pool of blood has formed. A young woman kneels at the edge of the pool, her back to us. She is naked and washing a white biblical robe in the pool of blood. She becomes aware that she is being watched. She looks over her shoulder at us. She is exquisitely beautiful. She stands, faces us, a striking white young woman holding her robe, which, despite its bathing in blood, is white and pure. Pan up the altar to the sacrificial lamb lying atop it. Its throat is still cut, its blood still dripping. But its face is now the face of Christ that was on the green Veronica. The chalk-white face with the Cupid doll spots on its cheeks and crown of thorns on its head. Image. Total silent blackness. Suddenly an explosion. A shattering flash of brilliant whiteness fills the screen. A high-pitched, screaming drone of energy. Waves of different colors pulsate and throb across the screen. One such wave bends, wrinkles, pinches up, and the first particle of matter is created. The screen is instantly filled with innumerable flashes, as the most primitive bits of matter smash and whirl maniacally. Flares of collusion. The blinding luminosity of an earlier universe fades into the soft glow of a cooling cloud of primordial hydrogen. Image. A small room with bare walls. Jessup and the beautiful young woman in a momentary fever of sexuality. He has seized her from behind. His hands clutch her breasts. He ravishes her neck with kisses and biting. She has thrown her head back, her neck arched in voluptuous pleasure. Image. A quick series of flickering images as Jessup experiences an ontological dematuration. Jessup as an embryo of 8 months, then as of 2 weeks, then a zygote, then as a single original cell, and then back up again until, with a scream, Jessup re-experiences the moment of his birth, his expulsion from his mother's uterus, gasping, suffocating, screaming. Image. The small room with bare walls. A bed. On the bed, Jessup and the young woman, naked in the throes of exuberant intercourse. Jessup plunging, thrusting. Jessup's sweating face, his eyes wide open, his mouth agape. from the shattering metaphysicality of this experience. Beneath him, the young woman's white body twists, responds, her legs locked around Jessup's waist. Her head twists this way and that. Suddenly, we notice her face is the face of Christ on the handkerchief, chalk white with red spots on her cheeks and thorns crowning her head. Camera moves in on the Christ face. The sound of Jessup's breathing, the short staccato panting of a man on the verge of orgasm. We are back inside the tank. Jessup's white mask of a face, eyes closed, cushioned in the blackness of the interior of the tank. Over this, Jessup's disembodied sexual panting continues, rising to crescendo. At which point, his body suddenly thrashes. His legs kick and splash the black water on which he floats. The white mask of a face remains serene and unchanged. Suddenly, everything is silent again. Silent and black, except for Jessup's white, sleeping face. Slowly, his eyes open. Isolation tank room, day. Wide-angle shot of the room, the black tank isolated in the middle, shrouded in shadows. Jessup. Arthur. Rosenberg. You want me to come in and get you out? Jessup. Yeah, I want to get a look at those EEG traces. Rosenberg gets up from his chair in the observation room and goes into the room containing the tank, climbing up above the tank in order to open the tube in which his colleague Jessup has been floating. Rosenberg. How do you feel? Jessup. Not bad. I hallucinated like a son of a bitch. A variety of dream states, mystical states, a lot of religious allegory, mostly out of revelation. Rosenberg. You were in there close to 5 hours. Jessup. It felt like an hour. Rosenberg. I'd like to try that myself sometime. Jessup. You should. You'll like it. Trousered, but still toweling himself up, Jessup heads for the door and goes into the monitoring room. Day. The small room is compactly fitted out with an oscillator and various recording machines, most notably a 16 styli EEG machine. 5 hours of polygraph paper have piled into the cardboard bin at its side. Jessup rummages about in the bin for the beginning of the sheet, puts on a pair of wire-rimmed glasses and studies the tracings. Jessup, reading. Did we have any communication? Rosenberg, from the doorway. Oh, sure. I kept checking you out like you told me to. Jessup, how did I respond? Rosenberg, very orderly. At one point you were crying. Jessup, you mean really crying? Rosenberg, you were sobbing. You had tears on your face. I asked you what was going on. You said you were re-experiencing your father's death. Jessup, did you make notes? Rosenberg, indicating a loose leaf notebook. It's all there. Jessup, I'd like to do this again next week, Arthur. Could you make it again next week? York Avenue Medical Building, late afternoon. Rosenberg, what are we looking for? Jessup, hell, I don't know. Yet, there's really very little literature on this, or research. There's some good people in the field. Tart, Ornstein, Dakeman, but most of it is radical hip stuff. Drug culture apologias. Obviously, the first thing to do is set up some sensible methodology. See if we can't study the experiences under controlled laboratory conditions. It won't interfere with the work we're doing with Hobart. Rosenberg, what are we getting into? Sensory deprivation? Isolation studies? I mean, where will we be going with this tank stuff? Jessup, we're not writing up a grant, Arthur. Strictly bootlegging just for kicks. I figure as long as we've got the use of this tank, let's play around with it. Let's find out where it takes us. This is fascinating stuff, Arthur, and I think we ought to get into it. Rosenberg apartment, Sunday. Day. Some dozen young 60s intellectuals in denim and jeans to subdued Janis Joplin pass joints around. All are in their late 20s or early 30s, except for a gray-haired sculptress, an aggressive 50. There is a geneticist with his wife, a biochemist with her husband, a couple clinical psychiatrists, and a great deal of movement in and out of the 4 small rooms that comprise the Rosenberg apartment in a battered old building on West End Avenue around 95th Street. Rosenberg apartment hallway. Arthur Rosenberg and Alan Hobart, a clinical psychiatrist in his early 30s, are sharing a joint with Emily Fulbright, a pretty, confident young woman in jeans who doesn't look her 24 years. She is a physical anthropologist and our heroine. The background is full of general party activity. Rosenberg. I didn't even know they had one of those isolation tanks at New York Hospital. Hobart. Must be some guys in the psychology department doing sensory deprivation studies. What's Jessup doing with it? Rosenberg. You got me. He's been taking students out of his classes and testing them. He's been doing this for 3-4 months. Did you know he was into this kind of stuff? Hobart. Not till you just told me. The doorbell rings, and Sylvia Rosenberg, 7 months pregnant, comes out of the kitchen into the hallway, making for the door and calling to her husband. Sylvia. I'll get it, honey. Rosenberg, who had started for the door, returning to Emily and Hobart. He's the last guy in the world I figured to be screwing around with anything as flaky as altered states of consciousness. Hobart. Well, let's face it, Jessup is pretty flaky himself. Across them and down the hallway to the front door, where Sylvia Rosenberg is admitting Jessup with much affection. Rosenberg to Emily. That's him. Emily is clearly interested. She appraises him openly from her end of the hallway, liking the bespectacled, fine-featured face. Sylvia Rosenberg herds Jessup into the living room. Hallway near living room day. 20 minutes later, Emily comes out of the kitchen, crosses into the living room. Emily surveys the room. Jimi Hendrix is on the stereo. The room has not too much furniture. An overstuffed chair on which Sylvia is heavily implanted, and a sofa where Jessup is seated. At the other end of the couch, the sculptress is making a play for the geneticist's wife. There is an open space on the couch next to Jessup, and Emily heads for it. The journey through the people lounging on the Levantine cushions on the floor or perched on the enormous round coffee table is not easy. Jessup seems distracted by his own thoughts. A joint is being passed, and when it reaches Jessup, he declines, but passes it along to the biochemist on a wooden folding chair at his elbow. Emily slides into the seat beside him. Emily. Arthur says you're very shy, and he wants me to draw you out. Jessup. Draw me out? That doesn't sound like Arthur. Emily. Well, what he actually said was you were a high-handed, arrogant prick. A little nuts, but brilliant. And that if I ever got you talking, I would find you fascinating. Jessup. That sounds more like Arthur. Emily. He says you're doing some work with him and Alan Hobart at Payne Whitney? Jessup. Yes. Emily. What sort of work? Jessup. Toxic metabolite stuff. She waits for more. He presses on with a little enthusiasm. Jessup. We're more or less replicating Heath's and Friedhoff's strategies, trying to find maverick substances specific to schizophrenia. I think we're chasing our tails. What do you do? Emily. I'm a physical anthropologist. I'm sweating out my dissertation. Jessup. Where? Emily. Columbia. Jessup. Holloway and that bunch? Emily. Yes. Jessup, you're kind of young for a PhD, aren't you? Emily, I'm 24. Jessup, that's still pretty good. I didn't get my PhD until I was 25, and I'm supposed to be a whiz kid. Emily, I'm a whiz kid too. Jessup, where's Arthur? Where's the mustard? Emily points out the mustard. Jessup, anthropology seems to attract good-looking women. Emily, so you don't think schizophrenia can be reduced to a single etiological agent? Jessup, I'm not even sure it's a disease. Emily, you think man is simply in another state of consciousness? Jessup, there's a body of evidence to support that. Emily, you don't like to talk about your work, do you? They smile agreeably at each other and have obviously hit it off. Columbia University campus, hours later, dusk. Emily and Jessup cross campus, engrossed in each other. Jessup, I've always been interested in interior experiences, especially the religious experience. The one reason I'm working with schizophrenics now is because the religious experience is so significant in schizophrenia. And there's just so much work you can do with animals. I worked with monkeys for 2 years, but monkeys can't tell you what's going on in their consciousness. You need human beings for that. And you're not allowed to ablate human beings, and you can't stick electrodes in their skulls. So I have to use some kind of trance-inducing technique, and the isolation tank seemed the least risky. Their eyes catch. There's clearly something alive between them. Jessup, listen, I'd like to go home with you tonight. Will that be all right with you? Emily, I have a roommate. We'll be confined to the living room couch. Jessup, what's wrong with the living room couch? Emily, you tend to slip off a lot. Jessup, I'm sure we'll manage. Emily, I'm sure we will. Jessup, so whenever you want to go there, you let me know. Emily, how about right now? Emily's flat, living room, night. 2 white bodies thrashing around on the dark sofa to culmination. Emily thrusts up, burying her face in Jessup's shoulder to avoid crying out. His moonlit back beaded with sweat. She subsides onto the sofa, opens her eyes. Her POV, Jessup's transfixed face. His eyes are wide, rigidly staring into space, entranced. Emily, what are you thinking about? At first, he doesn't seem to hear her. Then the entranced look dissipates. Jessup, God, Jesus, crucifixions. He rolls off her onto his back against her legs. Emily, well, just so long as it wasn't another woman. Nevertheless, a curious moment and an odd thing to say. She tries to see his face in the darkness. Finally slips off the sofa and joins him on the floor, leaning back. Emily, as a rule, do you usually think about Christ and crucifixions under sexual stress? Jessup considers his answer for a moment. When I was 9 years old, I used to see visions of saints and angels, even Christ himself. I saw him with the eyes of faith, hanging on the cross, his vesture dipped in blood. I had a whole cult that grew up around me. People came from all over to see this kid who had visions of Christ. I got mixed up with a little Pentecostal church in South Yonkers. In the middle of services, I would suddenly become transfixed, begin to babble in voices, and I would prophesy. Of course, I don't do that anymore, not since I was 16. She studies his shadowed face. Emily, were your parents religious? Jessup, anything but. My father was an aeronautical engineer, my mother a clinical psychologist. She watches him fascinated. Emily, what happened? I mean, how did a little kid who saw visions of Christ turn into a physiologist teaching at the Cornell Medical College? For the first time, he looks at her, strangely but agreeably detached. Jessup, I stopped believing. It was very dramatic. My father died a protracted and painful death of cancer. I was 16 years old and very fond of my father. I used to race to the hospital every day after school and sit in his room doing my homework. He was very heavily sedated. The last few weeks he was in a coma. One day I thought I heard him say something. I looked up. His lips were moving but no sound came out. There was his yellow waxen face on the white pillow and his lips were moving. A little bubble formed on his lips. I got up and leaned over him, my ear an inch away from his lips. Did you say something, Pop? Then I heard the word he was desperately trying to say, a soft hiss of a word. He was saying, terrible, terrible. So the end was terrible, even for good people like my father. So the purpose of all our suffering was just more suffering. By dinner time, I had dispensed with God altogether. I never saw another vision. I haven't told anybody about this in 10 years. I'm telling you now because I want you to know what sort of nut you might be getting mixed up with. They stare at each other in the dark room. Emily, Arthur was right. You are a fascinating bastard. 68th and York Avenue, December 1967. Day. Bright and sunny. Emily, in a winter coat and jeans, flushed a cheerful red from the cold, crosses the courtyard in front of New York Hospital. She turns up a pathway to Payne Whitney past a sign marked Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic. Payne Whitney Corridor, December 1967, day. Long institutional corridor. Dr. Hobart, whom we met at the party, is now in a white coat as he brings a woman patient down the hall. The woman is 28 years old and in ordinary street clothes, but manifestly mad. She has that razor-sharp look as she giggles and moves along with the doctor. A stairway door opens and Emily enters, pausing by the door to let the patient and doctor pass. They disappear into a room down the hall. Emily heads for the door just before it. An observation room, day. Emily enters. Jessup is already there, standing before a one-way window, observing. We look into a family therapy room where the patient we had seen in the hall is now seated on a leather chair that can unfold into a recliner. Alan Hobart reassures the patient. We hear his friendly voice via a speaker on the wall. Hobart, off-screen. You're looking really fine today, Phyllis. Much less agitated than last time. Are you feeling better? She giggles, stares at her feet and vaguely at the floor. As Emily joins Jessup at the window, they exchange smiles. In the therapy room, Rosenberg, also in a long white doctor's coat, reads from the patient's record clipboard. A medical technician, a young woman aged 25, is preparing the EEG leads. They also greet the patient affably. The patient sits giggling, her head bobbing. Hobart, off-screen reassuring. We're going to do all the tests we did last time. Do you remember them? Dr. Antonioni is standing right here in the room with you, so there's nothing to worry about. We'll put the EEG leads on you now if it's okay with you. The patient responds to nothing. stares emptily at the floor. Hobart tells the technician to go ahead with the application of the leads, which she does. Rosenberg holds blood pressure equipment as he pulls up a chair. Rosenberg, off screen. How's it going, Phyllis? He wraps the blood pressure cuff around her arm to take her pressure. In the observation room, Emily and Jessup watch silently, side by side. Emily. Well, it's settled. Metcalf spoke to Spencer again this morning, and it's definite. The job's mine. So I'll be in Nairobi doing my post-doc work, May, June, and July, and in September I'll be teaching at Harvard. Jessup. Terrific. Emily. So it looks like we'll both be teaching at Harvard in September. Jessup. Looks that way. Unable to keep her cool any longer, Emily faces Jessup, her face aglow. Emily. My God, Eddie, you can't get any tidier than that. We're going to be together in Boston, and I think we should get married. Jessup. I wish you hadn't said that. Emily. The idea had to come up sooner or later. You must have known. Jessup. You know, of course, I'm supposed to be at least a little bit nuts. Emily. A little bit? You're a mad monk. An unmitigated madman. So you don't have to tell me how weird you are. I know how weird you are. I'm the girl in your bed the last 2 months, and even sex is a mystical experience for you. You carry on like a flagellant, which can be very nice, but I sometimes wonder if it's me that's being made love to. I feel like I'm being harpooned by some raging priest in the act of receiving God. She would go on, but voices issue from the loudspeaker. Hobart, off-screen. The same? Rosenberg, off-screen, rewrapping the spymometer. Yeah. Hobart makes a note in his notebook. Emily. You're a Faust freak, Eddie. You'd sell your soul to find the great truth. Well, human life doesn't have great truths. We're born in doubt, and we spend our lives persuading ourselves we're actually alive. One of the ways we know we're alive is we love each other. Like I love you. I can't imagine living without you. So let's get married. And if it turns out to be a disaster, it'll be a disaster, and we'll shake hands and say goodbye. In the therapy room, Rosenberg gives the patient a shot. Jessup. He's giving her dimethyltryptamine. It takes effect in about a minute, and she'll trip out for about a half hour. Abruptly, he leaves Emily and exits into the therapy room. Through the one-way window, he can be seen standing over the portable EEG machine, watching the tracings. In the foreground, we see a noticeable change in the patient. She stops giggling and shuffling, sits stiffly, more controlled. The vaguely terrified vacuity of her expression abruptly changes to one of intense concentration, almost trance-like. Hobart is asking her his soft questions again. Hobart, off-screen. Do you feel different now? Patient, startlingly response. Yes. Hobart, less anxious? Patient, much less. Hobart, do you have any special feelings? Patient, I feel like my heart is being touched by Christ. Jessup is back again in the monitoring room. They watch Hobart draw a triangle on a slate and ask the patient to duplicate it. She manages to draw one leg of the triangle, but gets stumped after that. Jessup. There's a lot of religious delusion among acute schizophrenics. Some guys say schizophrenics are physically different from the rest of us. It's almost as if they were trying to change their physical selves to adapt to their schizophrenic image of themselves. Look, we'll get married since it's that important to you. I don't want to lose you. I'm not comfortable with women, and I'm not likely to find anyone half as remarkable as you again. I think I can make a reasonably good husband. You understand I'd rather not get married, but I'll go along with it. I don't want to lose you, you see. Emily, I suppose that's the closest thing to a declaration of love I'll ever get out of you. Jessup, am I really that weird in bed? Emily, sometimes. Jessup, shall I try to change? Emily, no, I kind of like it. Boston, Pinckney Street, April 1975, Saturday. Jessup is walking down Pinckney Street wearing neatly pressed slacks and a sleeveless sweater. He is 7 years older and beginning to bald a bit. He is trundling his 2-year-old daughter in a stroller with his left hand, holding a supermarket bag of groceries with his right. Hopping along behind is his 5-year-old daughter. Jessup is in animated discussion with a big, fully bearded, booming bear of a man, aged 38, Mason Parrish, smoking a pipe. Two young professors on a Saturday afternoon. They pause for a kid on a bicycle to wheel past them. Jessup waves to a neighbor. Boston, Myrtle Street, April 1975, Saturday afternoon. Volkswagens and station wagons are parked in front of the red brick, ivy-covered townhouses along a pretty tree-lined block in the Beacon Hill district. Arthur Rosenberg, also 7 years older and less bohemian in a sports jacket with leather patches and a Tyler shirt, is engaged in amiable conversation with his 6-year-old son. He cuffs the kid affectionately, and the boy trots back into the house they stand in the front of. Rosenberg looks up the block. Rosenberg's POV. Jessup and Parrish can be seen turning the corner off Revere at the end of the block. It is all too suburban for words, and Rosenberg can't help but smile. The two men are so engrossed in their conversation that they don't notice Rosenberg until they're virtually on top of him. Rosenberg. If I didn't see this, I wouldn't believe it. Jessup stops, stares. Jessup, my God, you weren't supposed to be here till next week. You got bald. Rosenberg. So did you. They pump each other's hands. Rosenberg, referring to Jessup's glasses. Are these new? Jessup. My God, this is sensational. To Parrish. Mason, this is the Rosenberg I'm always telling you about. Parrish. An ebullient, good old boy from West Virginia shakes hands. It sure is. Jessup, when did you get into town? Rosenberg, about 3 days ago. Are these your kids? Jessup, they are. Where's Sylvia? Is she with you? Rosenberg, she's inside with Emily. The Jessup apartment, living room. Sylvia Rosenberg, pregnant again, rising from the kitchen table where she's having coffee with Emily, shrieks with delight as the messy entourage enters. Sylvia tears across the living room to embrace Jessup, tears in her eyes. Everybody talks at once. Sylvia. Oh my God, you look so wonderful. Jessup, embracing her, notices she's pregnant. When did this happen? Have you found a place yet? Rosenberg, yeah, we got a nice little place near Huntington Field. Sylvia, oh my God, it's been 7 years since we moved to San Francisco. Emily, to Parrish, bearing groceries into the kitchen. Arthur's going to teach at Boston U. Parrish, So Eddie's been telling me. The Rosenberg boy comes out of the kids' room, silently regards all this adult effusion. At that moment, the Jessup 5-year-old slips into the room. Parrish, back from the kitchen, swoops her up to her shrieking delight. Sylvia, releasing Jessup. I can't believe it's been 7 years since we've actually seen you people. Rosenberg stands and beams at this jolly scene of reunion. The apartment, the ground floor, 3 rooms, 2 baths, kitchen, is a scholarly shambles. Piles of books clot the foyer and every room. Emily has set up a corner for herself in the living room. A bridge table for a desk, a typewriter barely visible among the periodicals, papers, scholarly journals, student theses, one of which flutters now onto the floor. Everybody talks at once. Rosenberg, across the room to Emily. I hear you just made associate professor. Emily. Yeah, terrific. Rosenberg to Jessup. You guys must be loaded. 2 professors in the family. Emily. Listen, we've got a place in Maine you can use for the summer. I'm going to Africa again in June. Eddie will be in Mexico. Jessup, plunking himself down in a torn chair. Listen, do you know a guy named Echevarria, University of Mexico? Says he worked with you in California? Rosenberg, removing some books to sit in other chair. Sure, a very bright young guy. Jessup. He's here in Boston at the Botanical Museum. We'll all have to get together. I'm going back to Mexico with him in June. Rosenberg. What's in Mexico? Jessup. Well, Echevarria's got this witch doctor down there, the Hinchi Indians, an isolated tribe in central Mexico who still practice the ancient Toltec rituals, sacred mushroom ceremonies, that sort of thing. Apparently, they use some kind of hallucinatory drug that's supposed to evoke a common for all users. Rosenberg. Sounds improbable. Emily enters. Eddie, Maggie has fallen asleep on the couch. Will you take care of her? Jessup takes a beat to register. Sure. Jessup scoops up his 2-year-old daughter sprawled on the couch. Jessup. Did you ever get into an isolation tank since New York? Did you ever get into an isolation tank since New York? Rosenberg. No. Did you? Jessup. No, but I just found out they've got one here at the medical school. Rosenberg. No kidding. I thought those things went out in the 60s. He carries the child across the living room and is followed by Rosenberg. Emily comes out of the kitchen with a tray of coffee cups and Toll House cookies. Parrish is lying on the floor, pretending to be knocked cold by the Rosenberg boy and the older Jessup girl. Jessup, en route, carrying his kid. I thought we did some pretty interesting stuff in that tank in New York for a couple of months. We played around with it. When I come back from Mexico, maybe we'll get into it again. Rosenberg. Why not? Jessup disappears into the kids' bedroom. Rosenberg pauses outside the master bedroom to watch his pregnant wife in front of the mirror. This room is no more orderly than the living room. Jessup's work area is here. An honest 3-drawer filing cabinet, an escritoire, a wall of bookshelves packed with texts, journals, and notes in hard-bound, loose-leaf notebooks neatly labeled. The rest of the room is in chaos. The double bed is unmade, and yesterday's clothing is flung over chairs or piled on the floor. Rosenberg notes to his wife. A terrific housekeeper she's not. Sylvia beckons him into the master bedroom. Rosenberg joins his wife at the bureau. Sylvia. They're getting divorced, you know. Rosenberg, startled. Who? What are you talking about? Sylvia. I don't know if they're actually getting divorced. They're splitting up. She and the kids are moving to a furnished place in Cambridge, and that's why the place is such a mess. They're moving her stuff into storage tomorrow. And she's going to Africa with the kids for a year, and he's going to Mexico. And when she comes back, she's going to live in Cambridge, and he's staying here. It's him who wants the divorce, not her. Listen, I'm surprised they stayed together this long. Rosenberg. When did all this happen? Sylvia. She just told me 5 minutes ago. Rosenberg stares at his wife, leans out into the corridor, and looks toward the kids' room where Jessup can be seen gently covering his 2-year-old. Rosenberg. What happened to all those letters she kept writing to us about how happy they were? Sylvia. Don't ask me. She's still crazy about him, and he's still crazy. Rosenberg. Jesus Christ. The back corridor. And down that, too, the kids' bedroom. From the doorway, Rosenberg watches Jessup lowering the shade, darkening the room. Even in the lesser light, the room is in a packing state. Opened cardboard cartons here and there, and little girls' dresses still on their hangers on beds, and toys are piled haphazardly. Rosenberg. Listen, Sylvia just told me you're getting divorced. Jessup. Well, we're separating anyway. We probably won't get around to the divorce till next year. Rosenberg. Look, it's none of my business. But why? You're married to one of the great women of the world who adores you. You're obviously a devoted father. My God, if anybody's got it made, you have. You're a respected and admired figure, a full professor on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School. Jessup, good-naturedly. Oh, for God's sake, Arthur, is that how you imagine me? A respected and admired figure? A devoted father? A loving husband? Well, I've also published nearly 2 papers for a year for the last 7 years. And not a fundamental piece of work in the lot. And I don't know why you're so startled we're getting a divorce. You're the one who thought she was crazy to marry me in the first place. Rosenberg. Well, that's true. Jessup. Well, don't be too upset. It's an amicable separation. Nobody's mad at anyone, and the marriage itself was sufferable as any of the others around. I think I've played my part well. I take the kids to the zoo. I stay up with them when they're ill. I romp with them when they're well. I sit around the living room of other young married faculty members talking infantile masturbation, who's sucking up to the head of the department and whose tenure is hanging on by a thread. Emily's quite content to go on with this life. She insists she's in love with me, whatever that is. What she means is she prefers the senseless pain we inflict on each other to the pain we would otherwise inflict on ourselves. But I'm not afraid of that solitary pain. In fact, if I don't strip myself of all this clatter and clutter and ridiculous ritual, I shall go out of my fucking mind. Does that answer your question, Arthur? Rosenberg. What question was that? Jessup. You asked me why I was getting divorced. Rosenberg. Listen, it's your life. I'm sorry I even asked. He turns to go. Jessup stands behind him by his daughter's bed. His eyes suddenly go white in the gray room. The monkish zealot cast of his face has never been more evident. Jessup. I want to be alone again. Renounce the rubbish of it all. Mortify my flesh. Scourge my spirit. I want to get down to the embedded rock of life, what St. John would call the bare and barren soul. He suddenly smiles, emerging from the room's grayness to the spill of light by the doorway where Rosenberg stands. He is honestly fond of Rosenberg and rests a hand on his friend's shoulder. Jessup, why don't I call Echeverria, and we'll all go out and have dinner? Dom's restaurant, night. At a noisy, cheerful table, 8 voluble academics gabble, swilling their wine, stowing their pasta. They're all talking over each other, and we don't need to hear anything clearly, but this is what they're saying. Emily, to Parrish's girl, a second-year med student from Mass General. What differentiates man from the chimpanzee is that man needs tools for survival, and therefore evolved a cortical structure that could make use of tools. To Rosenberg, who was thrusting a petition at her. Oh, for God's sake, Arthur, you haven't been in Boston a week and you're already a member of the Committee of Concerned Scientists. Rosenberg, just sign the damn thing, Emily. Emily, signing and rattling on to Parrish's girl as she does. A chimpanzee might use a stick to dig into a termite hill, but he can survive as a species without it. A baboon, whose diet is almost exclusively vegetarian, will take half an hour to dig up a root. It's just never occurred to baboons they could shorten that time to 5 minutes if they used a stick. Originally, man was just another savanna living primate like the baboon. Parrish, flirting with Echeverria's girl, a botanist from the Botanical Museum. Nobody really knows how memory works. Apparently, we remember everything we sense for about 50 milliseconds. Then it disappears or is selectively fixed in our consciousness. Now, you being a botanist sure as hell know puromycin can wipe out a memory, and sympathomimetic drugs like strychnine, amphetamine, etc. can stimulate the retention of memory. But these are all poisonous, addictive, induce convulsions, and are alien to the body. The fact that a small chain of amino acids, ACTH 4 to 7, a natural substance of the body, is instrumental in fixing memory is, I think, particularly interesting. This, however, raises another question. ACTH is a peptide. Its secretory rates are influenced by stress. Does ACTH actually code learning, or does it only relate to hormonal substances that formed due to stress? You really interested in this shit, honey? Because if you are, I'll be glad to go into it more deeply any night this week. Rosenberg, now harassing the elegant Echeverria with his petition. We scientists have a moral obligation to the public as well as to our own research. Some of those shotgun fragments could augment a bacteria's ability to produce disease. For God's sakes, they're chopping up fruit flies and inserting the segments into E. coli and mass-producing bacteria. We're dealing with a fistful of unknowns. We can only identify a couple of the genes. We could wipe out the planet if we don't watch out, so just sign the damn thing, Eduardo. If we can make anything out of all this esoteric jabber, it will be Jessup's discourse to Sylvia Rosenberg sitting at his right. Jessup, who was having a lot more wine than he usually does, is loaded and talking loudly. Jessup to Sylvia Rosenberg. As a matter of fact, the year I spent in India was disappointing. No matter how you slice it, yoga is still a state-specific technology operating in the service of a priori belief system, not much different from other trance-inducing techniques. What dignifies the yogic practices is that the belief system itself is not truly religious. There is no Buddhist God per se. It is the self, the individual mind that contains immortality and ultimate truth. Emily, interrupting her own colloquy to shout from her end of the table, "What the hell's not religious about that? You've simply replaced God with the original self." Jessup shouting back, "Yes, but we've localized it. At least we know where the self is. It's in our own minds." Standing not too sturdily, "It's a form of human energy. Our atoms are 6 billion years old. We've got 6 billion years of memory in our minds. Hell, our hydrogen atoms are even older." Beginning to weave a bit. "Memory is energy. It doesn't disappear. It's still in there." Wheeling on Rosenberg, ignoring the nervous interest he's raising at other tables. "There is a physiological pathway to our earlier consciousness. There has to be, and I'm telling you, it's in the goddamn limbic system." Parrish, roaring happily. "Jessup, you are a wacko." Jessup, "What's wacko about it, Mason? I'm a man in search of his true self. How archetypically American can you get? Everybody's looking for their true selves. We're all trying to fulfill ourselves, understand ourselves, get in touch with ourselves, face the reality of ourselves, explore ourselves, expand ourselves. Every sense we dispense with God, we've got nothing but ourselves to explain this meaningless horror of life. Well, I think that true self, the original self, the first self, is a real, mensurate, quantifiable thing, tangible and incarnate. And I'm gonna find that fucker." Mexico, Zacatecas Province, July 1875, day. As far as the eye can see are the terrifying sierras of central Mexico, rugged crags and violently plunging gorges seemingly uninhabitable. Another angle across Jessup in t-shirt and khaki shorts with Echeverria climbing and talking. Jessup carries a Sony tape recorder on their way up to the mountain. Echeverria holds samples of leaves and roots. Jessup, what are their chemical properties? Are they safe? Echeverria, climbing. The mushrooms are almost certainly Amanita muscaria, a very powerful psychedelic and a little dangerous. It contains some belladonna, alkaloids, atropine, scopolamine. The Sinicuchi plant is highly regarded among a number of Indian tribes. I've seen it as far north as Chihuahua. It should be especially interesting for you. The Indians say it evokes old memories, even ancient ones. The Hinchis call it the first flower. Jessup, first in the sense of primordial? Echeverria, yes, in the sense of the most ancient. Jessup and Echeverria have reached the top, and their POV reveals a plateau-like valley precipitously surrounded by brutal mountains, splashes of color. Jessup, I'd like to try it. Do you think they'll let me join in their ritual? Echeverria, they seem like agreeable people. In the land of the Hinchi. The Hinchi Indians, a tribe of pre-Aztecs, live amid the brutal barrancas of central Mexico. Although they are descendants of the Chichimec Toltecs, their brujo turns out to be a Tarahumara Indian who has married into the tribe. That helps because he speaks a little Spanish and can communicate with Echeverria. Jessup and Echeverria join up with the tribe just as they set off on their long trek to the sacred mushroom fields. This is an expedition lasting 3 weeks that winds through the colorful valley and gorges of a landscape filled with blue agave and yellow chaparral, and that is interrupted every other night to get drunk on corn beer. The Hinchi tribe, All 60 of them crossed the plateau like cotton pickers, in loincloths and cotton shirts and print dresses, filling burlap bags with mushrooms, branches of slender trees, leaves, petals, seed pods, and white tuberous roots, the last of which have to be dug out of the ground with bare hands. They all got back to their home valley on the 12th of July. Most of the tribe went on to Tusquanada, a 2-day binge of corned beer while the various powders and crumbled mushroom were stored away for a year in sealed gourds to become sufficiently moldy. Outside the Brujo shack, dusk. A shot or two showing some of the Hinchi tribe stretched out to rest around their shacks and tents, swigging corn beer. Their dogs lope in and out of view. 3 chosen women in shapeless cotton dresses kneel and grind roots and buds into varying degrees of fineness. In the background, the Brujo's shack, a ramshackle shanty with a shaky overhang held up by 2 rotting pilasters. The Brujo is a shaggy old man in his late 60s, whose contact with white civilization is evident in his shapeless gray single-breasted jacket and white-fringed prayer shawl. The fire at which he sits is actually a primitive hearth ground. Jessup has his notebook out and is putting a fresh cassette into the tape recorder. The Brujo smooths out the small blanket lying near the fire and empties his burlap bag, item by item, spacing them with some ceremony on the blanket. First is a hunting knife, a foot in length and glistening blue in the fading light. Then a soft brown leather pouch from which he extracts a ceremonial pipe, a dark reddish stem about 10 inches long with a blackened bowl. Before placing each item on the blanket, the Brujo addresses the 4 directions with the object, chanting in a low whine. Some of the men are biting peyote buttons and are stoned. Jessup's tape recorder whirs. Dusk is now descending. The valley is in heavy shadow. The last item out of the bag is a bundle of bound white plant roots. He draws one out, splits it with his knife into a Y, humming his chant as he does. He leans to Echeverria. Around the fire sit Jessup and Echeverria and 4 escogidos, the chosen men. Across the men at the fire, the 5th escogido, the man of power, the Brujo, sits in the center ready to deal with a stranger. The Brujo, to Echeverria. ¿Quiere su amigo participar un? Echeverria. He wants to know if you will want to participate. Jessup. Yes, of course. The old Brujo goes back to his soft chant, binding the forked ends of the split root with tendrils of a vine. 2 of the chosen women bring a iron pot out of the house to set it on the hearthstones. Jessup leans forward to examine the yellow sludge inside. Jessup. Ask him what kind of an experience I can expect. Echeverria. ¿Qué clase de experiencia puede esperar mi amigo? The Brujo. Su alma regresaría a la primera alma. Echeverria de Jessup. Your soul will return to the first soul. Jessup. Ask him what this first soul will look like. Echeverria. ¿Cómo es la primera alma? The Brujo. Es la materia incrada. Echeverria, Jessup. It is unborn stuff. Jessup looks up to study the Brujo and finds himself being studied by the old man's cat-like eyes. The Brujo speaks with Echeverria, translating quickly. The Brujo. Entonces, usted se lanzaría en el vacío? Echeverria. Then you will propel into the void. The brujo. Usted verá una mancha. Aquí varia. You will see a spot. The brujo. La mancha se convertiría en una grieta. Grieta. Aquí varia. The spot will become a crack. The brujo. Esta es la grieta entre la nada. Aquí varia. This is the crack between the nothing. The brujo. De hasta la nada saldrá su alma entrada. Echevarria. Out of this nothing will come your unborn soul. Jessup nods. The sun has disappeared. Shadows permeate the atmosphere. Cut to village with Jessup and elders in a procession through the stone mushrooms of the landscape into the brujo's cave. The brujo. Dígale que extenda la palma de la mano. Echevarria. He wants you to hold the root. Put out your hand with your palm up. Jessup edges closer and sticks his hand out, palm up. The brujo places the root across the flat of Jessup's palm. Suddenly, he separates Jessup's third and fourth fingers and deftly slashes the joint with a hunting knife. Shocked, Jessup screams. He just squats with his bleeding hand outstretched. The brujo seizes his wrist and pulls the bleeding hand over the pot, twisting Jessup's wrist so that the root falls into the pot. He holds Jessup's hand over the pot until a few drops of blood fall into the blackness. Jessup collapses, shocked, spent, and outraged. Echevarria, leaning over him. Are you all right? Jessup nods. The brujo and another man carry the pot to the ritual blanket. In the night, they seem like monstrous shadows. Jessup examines his bleeding hand in the darkness. Jessup. Jesus Christ. Echevarria. Are you all right? A form looms over him. He looks up. It's the old brujo holding out a cup of the liquid expressionlessly. Jessup sits up, takes the cup, and drinks. He gets up on his knees and then stands and exits the cave into the darkness. Behind him, he can hear the brujo and Echevarria mumbling. The brujo. Voiceover. Está funcionando la grabadora. Está fumando 3 partes de polvo de anguitos con una parte de polvo de sinicuchi y una parte de pipolocochital. Image. Jessup's body suddenly becomes 2 bodies. One remains huddled on its knees, vomiting. The other takes shape outside the first body and then whooshes up into the sky until he is hardly more than a spot, visible by a curious luminosity about him. Down around the fire, the others seem entirely innocent of this extraordinary event. A dog wanders into the ring of sprawling men, sniffs at Jessup's first body still on its knees. Image. The screen is now a dull, matted white, as if painted with heavy impasto streaks. The yellow of the lizard slowly leaks out into the whiteness, staining it. Losing its color, the lizard disappears. Then a strange pulpy shape appears, fissured and creviced, a grayish blob recognizable perhaps to biologists as a human brain, which folds and slithers into itself to take on other shapes, changing into soft, pulsating globules of matter, insinuatingly sexual, oleaginous in movement. What we are seeing is a de-evolution of the brain, as it passes backward across the evolutionary continuum through the brain of an alligator, then a codfish, until it oozes into the primitive linear ridged nervous system of a worm. Years. Image. Another biological dematuration process. Blobs of substance, grayish, constantly folding and unfolding slowly into curled up, loaf-like, cracked, and creviced adult brains, or the more simplified shapes of the brain of a 6-month embryo, to the bulging vermiform structure of the brain of a 7-week embryo. Finally, the brain of a 3-week embryo, hardly more than a hose-like structure with something stuck in its gullet. The bulging tip of a prosencephalon hanging down at the end of the thick snake-like thing as if it were ashamed. Image. The screen grows darker and darker until everything is silently, impenetrably black. Infinitely down below, a flickering spot. Perhaps the last conscious image of the fire where Jessup had been sitting. Then suddenly an unbearable flash of a pure white light, incandescent in the fraction of a second explosion of pure energy. Then it is all black again. Image. Enormous flames, unbelievably hot, out of which emanate sudden explosions. One of these white-orange flares zigzags across the flaming face of the screen, like a crevasse opening up in Arctic ice. Image. Suddenly, nothing is left. To see but this jagged crack stretching obliquely up as if the screen itself were about to crack open. Image. Everything else is black. Image. The crack is flaming red, then purple, then blue. Image. A violent series of images, none lasting longer than a second. Image. A flaming cloud of gases, hydrogen and helium, whooshes across the black screen at 90 million miles per hour, throbbing as it cools and contracts with gravity. Another such cloud. Another image. A huge spiral-shaped cloud condensing into blue, condensing into a trillion soft stars, an embryo galaxy. Image. A blue cloud of gases, now hotter and hotter, then redder and redder, as its trillions and trillions of atomic bits crush in on each other in a mutual gravitational attraction. The cloud is a flaming ball, a star, a sun. At the critical level of 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, it ignites and burns. Nuclear explosion following nuclear explosion. Image. A spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy, swirling tendrils of the primal mist, a water molecule freezing into an ice crystal, a flaming yellow mass, the sun, surrounded by an iridescent halo of ice crystals and grains of rock or iron. The coalescence of small fragments into a larger fragment as the central fragment sweeps its neighboring fragments into its gravitational pull. Image. An endless expanse of cold, airless, waterless rock begins to leak bubbles and beads of boiling radioactivity. A cloud of yellow sulfurous steam, a falling of yellow rain. Image. A silent sable sea of water, motionless, fills the screen. Image. All this flickering imagery is taking place across the blue, jagged crack that seems to be splitting the screen. The crack never disappears, but is a constant presence. Image. The crack erupts. spewing blinding light out like lava, the first Kabbalistic emanation of light. Image. Everything abruptly condenses back into blackness again. The blue crack is gone. In its place, a brownish figure, a molten mass of substance, appearing to have arms and legs and a head, but so protean that the limbs and distinguishing features keep dissolving or extruding, bubbling up here and there, swelling and contracting. It moves in surf-like emanations, expanding and lapping in slow, exorable waves. Image. A high-pitched, exultant scream. Image. The molten mass emerges larger and larger. Its substance seems to be iridescent, flaring with tiny flames. Image. Behind it, the screen is now gold. Image. A closer view of the mass. Tiny flames are exploding neural matter. Image. Now a large yellow iguana, its prehistoric jaws slightly agape, its tongue flicking in and out. The lizard waddles across the expanse of golden screen toward the pulsating, flaring mass of brown substance. It stops about halfway, suddenly wary, frightened. It edges on slowly, cautiously. Image. It's engulfed by the flaming molten substance. Its limbs are wrenched, ripped with a sickening scream of bone and muscle, out of their sockets. The pieces of the lizard are lifted up with the molten substance by the improvisations of arms, and the shapeless head bows to devour the lizard. Image. It slowly surges around him. Image. The golden screen grows reddish. The brown, orange, yellow objects lose their definition. Image. Again, the high-pitched, exultant scream. Image. The screen is again black. Image. The feeling of a bottomless shaft, a whoosh of precipitous descent. Image. We see things in what seems to be a black light. The screen fills with the branches of a tree. In the distance, a campfire flickering in the wind. Image. Jessup's white face, squinting to avoid the poking of the branches. The Hinchi Valley, the Brujo Shack Night. In the mountains of central Mexico, night falls on a valley where Echeverria, the Brujo, the other four escogidos are sprawled around their fire. Some sleep, but on the fringe of the firelight, barely visible, Jessup stands in a bosque. He is urinating. Reverse across Jessup as he zips up and returns to the fire. Echeverria looks up briefly. Nobody else notices. Under the overhang of Brujo's shack, two chosen women sit in shadowy bundles of sleep. A dog drifts through the bodies, illuminated momentarily by the firelight. Jessup joins the group, sinks onto the ground, lies back. The Brujo. Obtuvo la experiencia predicta? Echeverria. He wants to know if you had the experience that was predicted for you. Jessup nods hello to the Brujo. Tell him I did, and I also had an experience that was not predicted for me. Echeverria. Él tuvo una experiencia que no había sido predicta. The brujo smiles briefly. Así comió una lagartija. Acavaria. He says you ate a lizard. Jessup. How does he know I ate a lizard? Acavaria. ¿Cómo sabes que él se comió una lagartija? The brujo. Yo lo vi comer la lagartija. Todos lo vimos comer la lagartija. Acavaria. He says he saw you. They all saw you. Jessup. Does that mean he was with me in my hallucination? Does he have the ability to get into another man's mind? Acavario. ¿Estaba usted con mi amigo en su sueño? The brujo stares blankly at him. Acavaria. ¿Tiene usted la habilidad de entrar en el sueño de otro hombre? The brujo to Jessup. Yo lo vijo. Todos lo vimos. Acavaria. He says they all saw you. Jessup. But I ate a lizard in my hallucination. I didn't actually eat the lizard around the fire here. If he saw me eat the lizard, he must have somehow joined me in the hallucination. Acavaria. Él sí comió la lagartija en su sueño. The old shaman heads for the bushes where Jessup had been, some 15 yards away. He turns back and indicates he wants them to follow. Jessup and Echevarria start after him. The brujo pushes his way into the scratchy bosque, spreading the branches, holding them aside for Jessup and Echevarria. A few paces later, the brujo stops and points to the ground about 10 yards away. Jessup and Echevarria turn to look. Across Jessup and Echevarria, we see something on the ground, shrouded by the network of branches and by 4 dogs swarming over it, eating with the savagery of jackals. Jessup pushes into the thick tangle of bush, followed by Echevarria. Then they are struck by what they see and involuntarily close their eyes. Behind them, the brujo shouts at the dogs to back away. One of them has the leg of something in his mouth. Jessup's POV. Lying in a gel of dried blood and leaves is the dismembered torso of the remains of a green-crested iguana, terrifyingly legless. The empty white bone of the leg sockets white and flecked with blood. Half the torso has been stripped of its greenish skin. Gobbets of raw flesh and exposed viscera are open to view. Over this, the sound of a man retching. The brujo shouts at the dog, snarling to get back to the carcass. Echevarria is bent over, holding on to a branch, vomiting. Jessup turns aside and shades his eyes. The brujo turns and makes his way out into the clearing. Outside the brujo's shack, day. Jessup checks his gear, his sleeping bag, tape recorder, notebooks. Echevarria is packing, while occasional tribal activities go on in the background. Jessup, no longer in good spirits. First of all, iguanas are not mountain lizards. Echevarria. I know. Jessup. They are shore and jungle lizards. Somebody must have brought that iguana up here, and this whole hideous business is just a joke the Indians have played on me, just to make the gringo look like a fool. Echevarria. You asked me what happened, and I told you. You were crawling around on your hands and knees for a while. Then around 7:30, you got up and went to those bushes to urinate. I thought. Then it sounded like some of the dogs had jumped you. There was a great yelping and snarling and growling. Then you screamed. Or something screamed. And I and a couple of the women went to see if you were in any trouble. We had just gotten to the bushes when the screaming stopped, and the old brujo yelled at us to come back and forget it. Jessup scowls and lashes his gear tightly into one bundle. Jessup, do you think they'd let me take some of that mixture I smoked back to Boston? Echevarria. We can only ask. Jessup. I'd like Arthur to analyze, maybe synthesize it. Abrupt shock effect cut to a biofeedback room.